Hi, it's Wyndham. Welcome back to this awareness series, Let's Talk About Blueprints. The intention of this series is to really help shine a light on what I believe is actually happening in our lives and has happened in our lives that has led to the point we are at today and resulted in the lives we are living. It's a philosophy that I have developed over the last 10 years. And it really underpins the perspective I have, that is, we cannot address the things we are not aware of. So these videos are looking to provide some awareness. This video, I want to talk about inclusion criteria. I've referenced it a couple of times in the first two videos, but I want to dig into this a little bit more deeply because they are present in every single group we are part of. Sometimes they are very obvious, often they are less obvious, and sometimes they're made up. So inclusion criteria essentially are the requirements placed on us in order to remain included in a group. And if we go back to the first video, our old ancient mind hardwiring is constantly looking for acceptance. Acceptance requires inclusion, and that those two, inclusion and acceptance, equal survival. Right? And although we live in a modern world where our real survival is less threatened than at any point in human history, I appreciate there are parts of the world where that is not true. But if you are watching this video, the likelihood is your life is not threatened on a daily basis. However, the hardwiring in our minds doesn't get that. So we are driven by a survival instinct. That survival instinct seeks acceptance in groups because groups are safer than being on our own. In order to be accepted into a group, we have to meet the inclusion criteria of that group. And that will come down to, what we say, how we say it, the things that we do, our behaviours. Okay, so we know what inclusion criteria are at a very high level. So let's look at the types of inclusion criteria that we might be exposed to. And there are three distinct types of inclusion criteria. There are the explicit, the implicit, and then potentially, most dangerous of all, the assumed. So let me give you an example of each of those so you can contextualize it a little bit better. Explicit inclusion criteria. Anybody who is a fan of rugby union will obviously have heard of the All Blacks. It is the New Zealand national men's rugby team. And the All Blacks, I imagine it would be hard to find someone who wouldn't say that over the period of modern rugby union, they're the best side in history. Very small nation, drawing on a pretty small resource of potential players, and yet they have had greater success than any other international rugby team in the world. Every time a new player is brought into the All Blacks setup, there are a set of rules, there are a set of inclusion criteria required of that new player in order to remain involved. And I think the most famous is super simple. No dickheads. Now, we could get into the subtleties and nuance of what defines a dickhead. However, at a very high level, it appears very clear. It is explicit, it is clear. It really sets a threshold above which you remain included, below which you're out the door. Okay? So explicit, super clear. You may have them associated with your job, your roles and responsibilities. That's part of the inclusion criteria of you keeping your job, is to perform at the level they're expecting. So we have explicit. We also have implicit. Now these are much harder. They're much more subtle. For example, most groups of friends, there is certainly close friends, there is this general sense of piss taking, right? Now, there's no formal written charter of your groups of friends that say anybody who joins this group must be able to take and give a good piss taking. So it becomes implicit. And I'm certainly aware of groups of friends where, as those groups move through life, new people kind of come in on the peripheries. And if they are not used to that, then it can be very challenging. If they don't know the people in the group particularly well to begin with, that level of joking around can be very difficult. But it is an essential part of being part of that group. If you cannot meet that inclusion criteria, it becomes very difficult to get close and remain included in that group. So we've got explicit, the All Blacks, no dickheads. The implicit, close groups of friends, you need to be able to take a joke. And then we have this third one, and this third one is a really tricky one. It is the assumed inclusion criteria that we create and impose on a group. Now, we might be assuming it for seemingly very good reasons, and yet, if it is genuinely an assumed inclusion criteria, then we are shaping our behaviours based on our fears rather than actual inclusion criteria. For example, let's take a work example. We may be in an organisation where we look around and we think everybody is incredibly smart, much smarter than we are. Everybody is incredibly capable, much more capable than we are. Everybody seems like they're swans, just drifting through their days, perfectly at ease with everything, where we know we're panicking, we're freaking out, we do not believe we deserve to be there. An assumed inclusion criteria could be nobody asks questions to clarify. At the end of a presentation or at the end of a kick-off call or whatever it might be, and somebody goes, okay, any questions? Nobody asks a question. We might have 100 questions. We don't ask them because we believe, we have assumed that to ask that question would demonstrate a lack of capability, and that would potentially put us in a position where we are excluded from the group. Now there's a blurring here because that is a protection mechanism as well. But all of our adjusted behaviours in order to remain included and accepted, in order to remain safe, on some level, are protection mechanisms. Okay, so we have these three inclusion criteria: explicit, implicit, and assumed. And as an adult, I think I can look at my life and kind of go, yeah, you know what? I can start to identify in the past groups I was a part of that required me to behave and speak in a way that wasn't really true to who I was being. I can look back and then I can bring myself to the modern day and kind of go, actually, you know what? I don't think I do that anymore. I think I have managed the groups I am in and the groups I've changed to some degree. I no longer have a corporate career, which is a big one. I don't have to compromise from a professional perspective. However, that compromise is a really important word because the vast majority of the groups we are part of, the vast majority of the inclusion criteria that we adjust to in order to stay accepted, in order to stay safe, require compromise of who we really are. And let's look back. In the last video, we spoke about the three phases of the blueprint. Phase one is from our birth until we gain autonomy in our lives. Phase 2 is from that point of autonomy up to the point we choose to write our own blueprint. Let's go back to phase 1. Because in phase 1, we covered the idea that we have no awareness of what is going on and we have no choice. The groups we are a part of, our family, that primary caregiving environment, our education, and any other significant group we are a part of, we do not get to choose. So when we start reflecting, when we start shining a light on the inclusion criteria we have been subject to, let's point the light all the way back to when we were a child. What were the inclusion criteria in our family? What were the explicit ones? What were the implicit ones? And what were the inclusion criteria we made up because of the things we saw and heard? How did we adjust our behaviour to remain included? How were our emotions treated? How was praise given or not? How was success defined or not? You know, how was emotion demonstrated to us as well as treated from us? All of these things start to adjust our behaviour. And then when we go into a school environment, what were the inclusion criteria there? What did we hear when we were at school? You know, it's really, really powerful to start reflecting on those things because they happen at a point in our life, as I said, where we're not aware of what is going on and we have no choice. And our survival instinct, we're kids. Our survival instinct is screaming because we know we cannot take care of ourselves. So our survival instinct is screaming. We are adapting constantly. The other kids, not just teachers at school, but the other kids in school, how are we treated by them? We know kids can be brutal. What were the inclusion criteria of the groups we were a part of? What was required of us to remain safe? And there's two reasons why this is important. I think one of them is we can end up in a place of judgment when we look back and we can say, well, that's just completely unfair to expose a child to that. And my sense and my take on that is how many of the people who were setting those inclusion criteria were aware that's what they were doing? And how many of those people were aware that they had been shaped by the inclusion criteria of the people in their past? And how many of them were aware? How many of these people in our past were conscious of what was actually happening? So for me, I can look back and I was super fortunate. I've recognised that. I had a great upbringing, a great childhood. And still, there are inclusion criteria that I was dealing with as a kid that I am only just beginning to recognise now. Not only on the inclusion criteria, but all of those things we hear and see that we adapt to in order to remain accepted and safe, they start to filter in to our beliefs. In the last video I mentioned beliefs and truths in inverted commas, and that our blueprints are studded with these beliefs and truths. We're going to cover this in the next video. But when we sit there, coaches talk about limiting beliefs all the time. What we are talking about are the behaviours and beliefs and the truths that are holding us where we are, holding us back. But the reason they are doing that is because at some point in our past, the inclusion criteria to the groups we had no choice of, to remain accepted by those groups, required compromise of who we are and an adjustment to our behaviours. So I leave you with that. Can you start to reflect on your own life? The explicit inclusion criteria of the groups you are and have been a part of. The implicit inclusion criteria of groups. And then can we start to be really discerning? Can we start to exercise the 6 essential elements? Compassion, curiosity, connection, awareness, acceptance, intentional action. Can we exercise the awareness to say, actually, I think I made some of those up. I think I brought my fears, my previous conditioning, the previous inclusion criteria of other groups. I've brought all of that with me into this group. And I have behaved in a way that I wasn't explicitly told I had to. And actually, nobody else is doing it. I've brought that with me. And there's no judgment in that. These are all hardwired. They are linked back to our survival mechanisms. So when you spot them, we're just exercising our curiosity. We then exercise some compassion. Go, oh, that's interesting. I am a human being. This is what we do. It's hardwired. Until we get to phase 3, when we can start overwriting this stuff, there is no blame. There is no fault. There's just an opportunity to shed some light and then intentional action, move forward. I leave you with that. I wish you a peaceful and joyful few days, and I will speak to you soon.